talk about your background. And I know you have a YouTube channel. Tell me what it is. You can type some of that to me, like in an email, if you want, rather than saying it, because obviously I won't probably have all that in the audio, but I'd like to include some of that if people want to sort of jump on and find out more from you. Then I'd like to include your links and stuff.
Absolutely.
So maybe email them all to me would be great.
Will do.
But yeah, just tell me a bit about your background, what you do.
Okay. So I completed my naturopathy study in 1995, and at the time it included naturopathy, nutrition, homeopathy, remedial massage, and nutrition. And basically from then, you sort of end up going out into the world and dealing with real humans, and you realize you don't know squat. So from there, pretty much I got into the world of kinesiology, which was the next love of my life. So what was really cool about that was that I literally started maybe within 3 months or 6 months of finishing my naturopathy. And when I found kinesiology, I realized that when you ask the body questions, you can find all sorts of interesting answers. So from a naturopathic perspective, just say with anxiety and depression, how do you work out what way to go? Do you work on their diet? Do you work on their spiritual stuff? Do you work on their with essential oils? Do you work, adaptogens? So kinesiology helps to target the treatment program for a particular person. So it just allows, that dedicated one person solution as opposed to one solution for everyone, which I really loved with kinesiology. The kinesiology has taken me in many directions. My two main loves with kinesiology are NOT, Neural Organisational Technique, and LEAP, which is a Learning Enhancement Acupressure Program. So NOT is a structural head to toe. So from a purely structural perspective, it's when the gait's out of whack, your body might be twisted, it might be scoliosis of the spine, might be jaw clenching, neck tight, hips rotated, the spine being bent in different ways, kyphosis and lordosis and scoliosis. So the structural stuff is helped with NOT. What you end up finding, of course, is that nearly everything is connected emotionally and connected to physicality as well. So, for example, when the body's in a twist, why is the body in a twist? So if your body has a survival pattern running in the background, which we'll get to, then that can have the body permanently thinking, I need to run out the door. So it can shorten these muscles, lengthen these muscles, tighten these muscles. So you can go to a chiropractor every week for the rest of your life if you don't sort out the underlying survival stuff or the underlying emotional or PTSD that's locked into these muscles, traumas, survival patterns. You're not going to get very far. And once again, all the herbs and nutrients in the background can do only so much when there's survival patterns stored. And in the same way, if your mother had survival stuff while you were in the uterus, then that can come through as well. In fact, they found that up to 7 generations of how we cope with stress can be in our brains. So that's an area called the subclavicular gyrus, anterior cingulate gyrus, and orbitofrontal cortex. So those little areas of the brain make up a part of the brain called the periventricular survival pattern. And man, when that is involved, then basically it's not just our stuff. It is literally our mums, our dads, the genetics going back through several generations. When I was on radio, so I did 4BC radio for about 10 years with Walter Williams predominantly, but I had lots of other guys as well. And when I was on Bay FM, I had like a dozen people I had to train over there because it's amazing. You get someone new in that role on the radio, and especially when they're over a certain age, they just know nothing about natural therapies. But the fantastic thing was about that all the time is that it gets brought back to basics all the time, because you build up an audience of people who, love you, obviously, but there's also that needing to always remember who your audience is and bring it back down to a level where people can understand. So just because I know what I'm talking about with PTSD and survival patterns and the periventricular survival system, I know those are big words that are, they don't make a lot of sense until you actually start discussing them and nutting them out and working out what's going on. But it was a really amazing experience having so much radio time for a decade. It was really neat. And around that time, I started my big clinic. So I had 2 big clinics for 12 years, 13 years. And I must have hired maybe 30 practitioners in that time. And that again gave me a huge amount of, I worked with amazing Reiki masters. I worked with incredible acupuncturists and people who did all sorts of energetic healings and different specific types of massage like Chini Sing, which is amazing for anxiety and depression. So, it was working through other practitioners and working out their skills and having them work on my client that all of a sudden what a surprise, you find out that everything affects everything in the body, and it's just finding that perfect union of things to work for the client sitting in front of you at the time with something that they're willing and able and happy to try. So, about 25 years ago, I suppose, 26 years ago, I finished my training and been working full-time ever since.
Fantastic. Yes, you have a wealth of knowledge, and that's definitely evident. So, good for you. Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. Just want you to tell our audience basically what is anxiety and depression. So obviously it's complex, but
yes,
in a way that they can just understand what it is.
So if you imagine anxiety and depression are 2 sides of the same coin, because our hormones go up, our hormones go down, our neurotransmitters go up, our neurotransmitters go down. If we have an excess of some neurotransmitters, we'll have anxiety. If we have a depletion of some neurotransmitters, we'll have depression. So they can absolutely flip, and many people with either anxiety or depression say, oh my God, I do get that symptom, or oh my God, I do get that. So sometimes the same people who get anxiety can get depression and vice versa. It's more rare to have someone who is purely a depression person or purely an anxiety person when you do actually start nutting out what's going on for them. So with anxiety, there is an excess of stress hormones that their body can't eliminate, the brain can't release, and it ends up creating a inflammation in the brain at all times. So particularly things like cortisol tends to be high, CRP, C-reactive protein, an inflammatory hormone, it can be quite high in anxiety. It can be high levels of glutamate. Glutamate is an excitatory hormone that once again, when we can't calm it down, it keeps the brain switched on, keeps the brain vigilant, so the brain is constantly on the lookout for what's going wrong. So anxiety is a fear of something happening in the future. It's often indefinable. People often say to me, nothing's wrong in my life. I don't know why I'm feeling this. And quite often, once again, that can be because of either an underlying condition or underlying mineral deficiencies and all sorts of things. But basically, anxiety is an excess of stress hormones that the body's having a hard time calming down. With anxiety as well, there's underlying a lack of a certain things as well. So there can be a lack of magnesium, which is calming, a lack of oxytocin or serotonin or GABA. GABA is the anti-anxiety hormone for the brain. So at the very least, the hormone GABA, you can buy that and give it a try and sort of see how it feels. Because sometimes when we're just given anti-anxiety drugs or just given antidepressant drugs, it doesn't do anything about the underlying mineral deficiencies or other things that are deficient in the system. With depression, there's a lack of ability. So the classic depressed person is slower to move, slower to anger, slower to their body. That physicality is quite sluggish. And there's a lack of the dopamine, the serotonin, the oxytocin, those feel-good hormones for whatever reason just aren't there in the background. So if they had that cortisol, glutamate going, they'd probably be more in an anxious state, but without those excitatory hormones, they feel sluggish, which is why they can easily be mixed up with other conditions like Graves' disease, say, which is a hyperactive thyroid condition, or Hashimoto's, which is a hypoactive thyroid condition, for example, because Hashimoto's feels like depression to a lot of people and Graves' disease feels like anxiety for many people. So if someone's just going in, and I think we chatted about this, on average, women in Australia get about 8 to 12 minutes with the doctor before they're prescribed antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs. Like, that's on average for mental health in Australia. Whereas men, because it's so hard to get a man to go see the doctor, they will be feeling with more anger and frustration and irritability. And that can actually manifest for men in both anxiety and depression, because men want to problem solve. They just want to get out there, do their day's work, come home and feel okay. So when they're not feeling joy or peace or love in their life, then the thing that they can do is create anger, because anger is actually quite a useful emotion. Anger can get things done. When you're pissed off, you're more likely to actually make a change in your life. So men are more likely, when they go to the doctor, to have a whole barrage of tests done, which is amazing when men and women can go in for exactly the same symptoms. There's been several studies done on this in Australia over the past dozen years, where it's been found over and over again. Women are just burnt out because we have kids. Men, they must, need some blood tests, must be something physically going on. So it's interesting how we're treated quite differently.
That is very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Just on that, how do we sort of, I suppose, anxiety and depression, how does it tend to show up in the body for people usually?
Yeah. So once again, with either of them, so with the people who, once again, this is classic depression, classic anxiety, because everyone's a mixture of both. But true depressed people are more likely to have issues with their weight. Their body feels sluggish, they can't move, their body feels heavy, that dense energy that gets stuck in their energy stops them from being able to move forward and live their best life. And they often don't even realize they're not. It's people like me that I often say, well, what would you be doing if you could do anything in your world? What would it be? And the amount of times people just cry on the table and say, no one's ever asked me that before, is just heartbreaking. People don't think in terms of me because we feel like it's very selfish. But if you're anxious and you're depressed, you need to be going back to self and asking what it is you truly desire. So if we're not getting there, then people often, so with the body in relation to depression, because it's sluggish, there's often a lot of liver issues as well, because the liver, all of the blood goes through the liver all the time. When our body is running in survival, there's a particular hormone the liver releases called fibrin. And fibrin is an acute phase protein that is released, and it makes the blood sticky. So it does it deliberately. And it does it because, once again, going back to the tiger. So let's think about a tiger for a sec. If a tiger walks in that room, and think anxiety for a sec, then you've got about, half a second to decide what you're going to do with that tiger. You can't sit down and write a pro and con list and how have I ever done it in the past? It's not like that. So your body's got a moment. So when your body is releasing this stuff called fibrin, it's a blood clotting agent. Because our body doesn't know the difference between survival now and survival 10,000 years ago. Survival now, it's all the stuff like, will I stay in this marriage? Will I quit this job because I'm being bullied? My 13-year-old is treating me like crap. It's sort of like our day-to-day stuff these days isn't like living as a cave woman. It's quite different, and yet our body acts exactly the same. So it slows down our metabolism so that when we get punctured by the tiger, we don't bleed out and die. Now, if that happens a few hours a day or all day, every day for months, then we've got a sluggish metabolism that can't take nutrients in, it can't get waste products out. So it ends up putting an overload on all our organs of detoxification. So our lungs, our liver, our kidneys, our bowels, they all end up overworking because everything is slowed down so much. And I've got so many people, and of course one of the delightful side effects of antidepressants for so many people is weight gain. And they absolutely know that for many, many people on antidepressants, it slows the metabolism. So then you've got this double whammy. You already felt like, you didn't feel great before you go on antidepressants, and all of a sudden people are putting on 6 kilos in a year, and makes them feel worse and worse and worse and worse about themselves. So So that's sort of depression. And then with the way the brain feels foggy, the brain feels fuzzy. It's hard to take in information and understand what's going on. And that's where, the more we use our brain, that, you don't use it, you lose it. So we've got to be doing things on a daily basis that help us to get that brain up and running. And it's worth getting that anger going. Why is this happening in my life? Why can't I move on? Because anger can be the flip side to depression as well. And quite often it's said in the kinesiology world that depression is internalized anger. So what are we angry about? What has happened in our past that's made us feel like this? And owning that, and then trying to find solutions to that. Because sometimes it's like the whole Alcoholics Anonymous thing. The first step is working out you've got a problem. With anxiety, it's a fear of the future. So and sometimes it's quite intangible. So people don't always know what that is. And once again, especially when we've got survival stuff going on in the background. So people who are anxious often burn more calories, and they sort of estimate about 20% more calories than the average person. So if someone's anxious and they're constantly burning an extra 20% of calories, it's easier for them to stay thinner. Because they're those sort of people. They're anxious about that dirt on the floor. They stand up and they sweep it. They're anxious about someone coming to the front door, so they might clean the oven, or, they're constantly on the move. And it ends up, so that extra calorie sort of keeps their weight more under control, but it's not necessarily a healthy weight, because that's a problem as well. Because one of the things with high stress is that we can become something called sarcopenic obese. And sarcopenic obese is when you're skinny fat. So people who sort of have lost muscle mass, they're about the right weight, but they've gained fat mass. And you can sort of see it in teenagers a lot. I don't remember it, as a teenager so much, but there's sort of like almost a puffiness on top of the muscles. And it's a bit of a sign of, well, it's this skinny fat thing. So basically you might be the perfect body mass index, but be under muscle and over fat mass. And that has exactly the same risk management as being obese does. Like, it means that we've got less storage capacity because we store a lot of minerals in our muscle mass. So if our muscle mass is low, and I'll tell you a story about that. When our muscle mass is low, that's where we store a heck of a lot of nutrition. So going back about 10 years ago, when the GFC hit, so at the time I had about 10 team members at my first big clinic down in Wynnum. And over a period of 4 months, we were bleeding about 10 grand a month from it was just disappearing. And basically I had to sack 6 out of 10 team members over a period of a few months. It was when I turned 40. It was, so 12 years ago, ruined my 40th birthday. So it was sort of like, it felt like one of those worst times in my life. Now, because I do a lot of bioimpedance screenings, that gives you a measurement of fat mass, muscle mass, hydration, inflammation, that sort of thing. And over a period of those 4 months, I lost 30% muscle quality. The muscle quality in my body went down, and I can't remember, I was still vegetarian back then, but I lost a couple of kilos of muscle mass as well as 30% muscle quality. That took me a year to regain, working hard at it. So when we're anxious and stressed, we're also changing our biochemical composition in the body, because those hormones that we're releasing when we're anxious, the cortisol, the noradrenaline, the adrenaline, they're inflammatory. Short term, they're amazing. You always talk about people, a mother could pick up a jolly car if her kid was underneath it. Those stress hormones can make women into super women and men into supermen. But long term, cortisol is the only hormone that continues to go up as we get older in just about everyone, regardless of stress level. So it really can change the biochemistry in people's body, being both anxious and depressed. It can mess with the gut, because anxious and depression, there'll often be those survival patterns in behind. And survival pattern tells your body what's going to happen in the next 10 seconds. It doesn't matter about long-term metabolism, so your thyroid can slow down. Doesn't matter about digestion, so it'll slow down your digestion. Doesn't matter whether you're detoxing, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we're eating, so it can slow down your detox organs. So it can really change things quite dramatically in the way the body's working.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, pretty interesting. Yeah, and long term, pretty devastating for people's sort of health. Thank you, though, for that. So I guess, have we covered then in what you've just been speaking about how it affects our body, or is that more the symptoms?
Well, let's, because I haven't quite gone into the survival stuff yet, so I'll sort of chat a bit more about that.
Yeah, please.
So there's a couple of different things in relation to survival and stress. So one's the amygdala. So let's chat about the amygdala for a sec. So people know the amygdala from things like, say, Vietnam vets. So people who have come back from war, they've got PTSD, they hear, the car backfire, and they're on the floor under the desk hiding in a second, or they're grabbing their gun they're at the front door. So, so people with that sort of amygdala reaction to stress, that's the amygdala. So the amygdala is the size of an almond. There's two sides of it, a left and a right. And basically it has some core patterns that we go into. When our brain is under stress, we've got 1/500th of a second to respond logically and creatively. Otherwise we go into survival. Or we go into the amygdala pattern. So if we don't respond with a logical, creative solution, our brain will go to our amygdala and say, okay, amygdala, there's 5 major patterns. Do we need to go into fight, rage, anger? Do we need to go into fear, threat, danger? Do we need to go into a pain and punishment circuit? Do we need to escape, submit, or freeze? Or do we need to switch off our pleasure reward centers so that we're not enjoying ourselves, so the tiger doesn't attack when we're not looking? So there's sort of the core 5 amygdala patterns that we go into if we don't think logically and creatively about a stress that's happened. So that's the amygdala side of things. And then if that happens, then it does a whole bunch of other stuff. So it can shut down the frontal cortex, make it really hard to think, hard to find solutions. So you're there trying to find solutions, and sometimes your brain just literally switches off, just isn't working. And you think, oh my God, why can't I find a solution for this? And it's a real challenge for some people. And it's sort of like, people often describe it, especially with, say, Hashimoto's, that it's a fuzzy brain feeling or a cotton wool feeling in the brain. So you're hearing stuff, but it's all doughy and not bright and alive. So when the frontal cortex shuts off, it's nearly always because the energy goes to the rear of the brain. This is where our lizard brain is, our reptilian brain, our survival brain. So when we have a trauma that's bigger than amygdala, so it's bigger than just those 5 things, and that can be anything, and it's different for different people depending on our resilience. So let's take, for example, a car accident. You might get one person who has a car accident, writes off their car, they ring their hubby, the hubby goes, as long as you're okay, it's all good, and immediately they start to calm down. Someone else might have exactly the same car accident and go, holy crap, how am I going to tell my partner? I know he's going to be furious about this. And, so it totally depends on our perception of stress a lot of the time as to where we end up sitting in the stress cycle. So for people who have a big trauma and that trauma continues, so it's not just one survival thing like the car accident, thank God I survived, but then it's the trauma of the police interview, and it's the trauma of the other people lying, and it's the trauma of the videos not working that was supposed to be working, and then it's the trauma of the financial stuff and the trauma of hospital visits. It's just one after another after another. That can activate something in the brain called a survival pattern. And if those survival patterns end up taking hold, then it ends up becoming, that is your life from that moment. Your brain believes that life is going to be stressful from that moment forward, and it never switches off the survival pattern. So those people, their gut will constantly need work. Their adrenals will constantly need work. Their liver, they will constantly be battling all sorts of things. And it doesn't matter how many nutrients, supplements, exercises, grounding things that they do, while the survival stuff is in that background, they can't move forward. It's really, really challenging. So, and I've just thinking about that for a sec, I had one lady years and years ago, and I think for about 4 years, she came in once a month and we did a survival pattern treatment. And it just, and we were always dealing with little bits and bobs, and she was feeling better about herself, and she was a really big girl. I can't remember how big, but she's shorter than me, maybe this tall. So, 5 foot nothing. And she, I remember after about 4 years, and we were muscle testing, and I said, "Oh, you don't have a survival pattern." And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I don't know. I haven't found it before." And I said, "Okay, what do you want to work on today?" And it was sort of, and then I think about this woman's history, and there were several things going on. She had a mother who, if she didn't hate her, she had never treated her well, had never said, "I love you." She'd always treated the other daughters much, much better than her. She was a black sheep of the family, never, ever felt part of that family community. One of her daughters died when the daughter was 8 months old of leukemia. Another son died in a car accident. And then from there, she had issues with daughter-in-laws and all sorts of things. So it was sort of like when you sort of looked at the history, she had obesity from when she was really little. She had, because there was always that lack of connection to her mother. And it's sort of, it doesn't matter how much counseling you do with someone, if you don't feel that connection with your mother, then that's going to create a trauma in your life that's really hard consciously to get past, especially when the mother's still in your life. So you're feeling it. It's like being beaten every time you go see someone if you can't let it go. And hey, it's really hard, when you're not getting that bonding with your mother or your father or those close family members that you're supposed to have. And then feeling traumatized every time you see someone, it just adds more fuel to the fire. So with her, she would lose weight, and then it would come back, and we'd do different processes, and she'd do heaps of exercise, but it was like one of these things that was a constant battle. Since and now I'm guessing, just at a guess, maybe it's about 6 or 8 years since we went through that 4 years. So she's been able to pretty much maintain her weight for the last 6, 7, 8 years. She's had other stuff happen, but it hasn't added survival patterns. So now she sees me once a year or something and go, no survival stuff. What's going on? Let's do a balance. So it's quite different once someone clears those survival patterns. That's a huge one for people. And I don't know how we deal with that consciously without kinesiology. I know everything helps. Everything we do positively, whether it's sunshine and exercise, whether or not it's the supplements, whether or not it's yoga and meditation, whether or not it's, everything we do, creating that tribe in our world of people who do love and accept and understand us, so that we've got that love and connection when we're not getting it in other areas of our lives. We've got to have that tribe. We've got to connect to people, because connection's everything. So yeah, it can really affect things in a big way. Does that answer your question?
It does. That was really interesting, because when you first said if they still have that survival going on, then they really can't move forward because that continues to happen.
Yes.
But then obviously in her case, she was able to work over a long period of time to clear that. Short of doing it that way, I guess it doesn't happen then. It's not possible to clear that any other way.
Yeah, that's the thing I don't know. And the only example I have for that is I had a hubby and wife come in on the same day. They had been through bankruptcy, they'd lost businesses, they had a whole bunch of rental commercial stuff. They lost huge amounts of money there. They'd pulled all their money out of super to put into these commercial premises. So imagine all of that for a sec. And then, so hubby and wife both saw me on the same day. Wife was self-medicating with a bottle of wine every night, whereas, and some supplements, but she'd actually ended up, I think, because of the trauma, had created a pituitary gland tumor. So that had come on during all this stress going on. Whereas the hubby, he was learning Qigong, Tai Chi. He changed his whole world. He quit a corporate job. He was going into being a personal trainer along with meditation, Qigong, Tai Chi, that sort of thing. So when I muscle tested up when she needed to come back, it was 3 weeks. When I muscle tested up when he needed to come back, it was about 4 months. So same trauma on the same day. He seemed to be doing more in his daily life to really help him to deal with things consciously. whereas she was suppressing everything with alcohol, which, as we know, is a depressant. So, and she was also a 5 cup of coffee a day girl as well. So, you know, you're raising your anxiety with the coffee and you're being a depressant with the alcohol. So 2 people, same situation, same family, same day, muscle tested up when they needed, you know, and it was quite massively different. So I think everyone's different, of course, but I think the more we're doing in our daily life, the better. Have we chatted about the ACEs study? Like, have you heard of the ACEs study?
Yeah.
So it was a huge study. So it's the Adverse Childhood Events study. And it was done, and it was released a long time ago. And basically what they looked at was kids who didn't feel safe within their home environment. And I think at the time it was basically 10 questions. And it was things like, and I can't remember, it's been a few years since I looked at it, but it was things like, do you feel safe when you go home? Have you ever been made to feel unsafe in your home environment? You know, so it was stuff like that. Maybe there was questions in there about abuse and things, but it was very vague. And one of my friends, she actually was a 10 out of 10 for that. And she has had, and in her world, her mother is also still alive. And her mother is a classic narcissist. So is her brother, the 2 people she's closest to in her world. So she is constantly the person who's being abused by the 2 main people in her world. She's tried to let them both go, you know, and I think she got up to 3 years at one stage, and she was doing quite well during those 3 years. But she got really lonely, basically, because anyway, she went back into the fold again. But when she, sorry, what was my thought there? Yeah, so with her, one of the things, there's a couple of things that they know from a genetic perspective that happen when we have these traumas during childhood. And one of the things, once again, thinking about the physical body, they're all more like there's massive increases in diabetes, there are massive increases in heart disease, masses of increase in dementia and cancers and obesity. And in fact, there's a woman who I love called Dr. Pamela Peake, and I listened to her at a seminar a few years ago, and she has a YouTube video called Hijacked by a Cupcake. And she talks about how our genes are literally changed when we have abuse over and over and over again. And it ends up being that our body, it's nothing about the food we're eating, it's about the hormones that are created when we are being traumatized and how that is then affecting every cell in our body. So they're guessing these days, you know, they just don't know about obesity, except that they know that in this ACEs study, there were a lot of people in it, like 20,000 people or something like that. So it was a fairly major study, and it was over decades. It wasn't, you know, it was over decades, and it was many people. And so this Dr. Pamela Peake, she said, look, if people aren't obese, if they've had these traumas go on, it's more magical than anything. They must have just found that perfect person in their world, you know, to help to release them from the bondage of that trauma of their childhood. You know, and sometimes we do have that perfect person come into our life at different stages, and they're just what we need to help us realize, you know, that, hey, I am worthy, I am lovable, I am okay. You know, whatever you say, that doesn't, you know, I'm not taking that on. That's your stuff. You know, and I think it's huge. It's huge to get to that point for so many people. So yeah, Hijacked by a Cupcake, very funny little video by Dr. Pamela Peake. She's good value.
One I'll have to go watch, I think, by the sounds of that. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that has come out about, you know, our childhoods and childhood traumas.
Yeah. Well, funnily, yeah, so she, I'm just sort of thinking, when I first became aware of that doctor, it was when there's these particular mice called agouti mice. And agouti mice have been designed to be the perfect mice to experiment on in labs, because I think they've changed their bacterial combination or something, but they're always born and they're always fat, fair and flabby. So if you look them up, you know, they're sort of like a yellowy color. They're always fat. Whenever they do studies on just about anything, they're the ones who will just become obese at the drop of a hat. So they've used these mice a few times over the years to sort of go, well, what if we do this and what if we do that? So she was working with some scientists, and they said, well, let's just add methylation. So methylation, it's a process in the liver where lots of greens. So let's add greens. So they got these little mice and they fed them nothing but greens for a life cycle, and apparently mice don't last that long. But anyway, when the next mice were born, they were lean, mean fighting machines. So the scientists were like, holy moly, we have changed their genes, because their genes literally have been made to be flipped on for obesity. So within one life cycle, eating nothing but greens, it flipped them back. And this next generation, and the scientists had no idea. This is when they started going, hang on, our genes aren't set. So, you know, like we always get told at the doctors, oh yeah, you've got blood pressure, it's genetic, or we've got diabetes, it's genetic, or obesity's in the family, it's genetic. But so much of it we have control over ourselves. So when they did that with the mice, they actually determined that, hey, we can change the genes, you know, that was just by diet and nothing else. And then they used those same mice to work out if there's different probiotics and things that they could do to support better weight as well. And I know weight isn't the real issue, but it's a huge thing when it comes to the side effect of a lot of these medications, because I even know the anti-anxiety drugs a lot of the time, because they're slowing down metabolism, once again, people tend to put on weight. So yeah, the agouti mice, they're sort of an interesting experimental group used by scientists.
Fascinating, isn't it? Like that sort of that. Yeah, crazy stuff. Okay. Right. I guess I'm getting on to now traditional medicines and things for anxiety and depression. Obviously, everybody knows that traditionally, one of the first things they do is give you a tablet, a pill.
Yes.
To, you know, for those sorts of conditions. And as you were saying earlier, in 8 to 10 minutes generally.
Yeah.
You know, oh yes, that's what you've got. And I guess, I suppose, diagnosis is another thing that's interesting, is, you know, how they diagnose that it's even that in 8 to 10 minutes, was pretty brief. But yeah, so I know it's not your area, obviously, traditional medicine, but you obviously know about it. Can you talk a little bit about what they traditionally do for these conditions?
Yeah, so medically, they tend to, I think they are actually trying a lot of cognitive therapy, which works in a lot of people if people are willing to go down that route. But yeah, the medications themselves, because they are so targeted to a specific part of the brain, they know there's long-term side effects. So because people have been using them for 30, 40 years now, even longer than that, things like, for example, for every year that we are on antidepressants and anti-anxieties, it can, in some people, shrink the brain by about 5% per year. So you can imagine that's a real problem, because dementia is, of course, when the brain is, you know, just is shrinking. The neurons aren't firing as well. So any shrinking of the brain is not a great thing. With the antidepressants and anti-anxieties as well, many people have issues with sleep. So then they get thrown on a sleeping drug at the same time. So it usually doesn't start with one. And teenagers these days, do you know any teenagers have been, they're being treated in Australia with a combination of 3. As a general rule, if a teenager goes to a doctor for anxiety or depression, they start with 3 drugs. Now, I don't know if it's every doctor who do this, but these are the parents who obviously are going, oh, hang on, I'm only thinking about an antidepressant. I'm not. And they usually do an antipsychotic, an anti-anxiety, and an antidepressant as the combo here in Australia. Or at least that's what I've seen with my clients. And I think that's what makes parents go, really? For anxiety? You know, it seems a bit over and above. So the good thing about natural therapies is that they can work in the background of these drugs. So kids often, you know, feel sick. I mean, I'm thinking, I've got a few teenagers I'm working with at the moment, which is why I've sort of gone there. And once they get on the drugs, they're told they're going to be on them for a decade. You know, they're not told there's really any chance of getting off them. So even they're priming these teenagers to be on them, you know, for 5, 10, 15 years, even from day dot, which is pretty interesting that that's the mindset medically. Whereas they actually did a study, once again going back about 5, 6, 7 years in the States, and they looked at different states in America. And I think they had 6 states where they pulled apart the data associated with anxiety and depression. And they were trying to find out what triggered the anxiety and depression. And they found out that if it was this is sort of the thing between a one-off incident or long-term stress. So once again, if you've got long-term stress and then you've got depression because of it, it's going to take a long-term solution to flip it around. The brain isn't magical enough to just be able to just flip on its head in a heartbeat. But what they found was just say it was a car accident or a death of a loved one or a breakup of a marriage or the loss of a job, a one-off incident, without medication, those people tend to improve within 6 to 12 months naturally anyway. Whereas if those people are put on medication, then they're likely to be on drugs for at least 2 years before even being considered to come off, because it takes a good 6-9 months to get a drug where people are feeling okay, and then you have to wean them down again as well. And that weaning process for some people, it's really quite dramatic. It can be a real challenge for people to get off these medications. So I think when it comes to how the medications affect, I don't think a lot of the time they know how the drugs are affecting our brains yet. It's sort of a lot of guesswork and playing around with drugs and seeing which ones work and which ones make you feel worse. Like one of my guys went into a mental hospital, and I think he was about 18 at the time, and once again got the triple therapy, and they were wanting to do the ka-chink to the brain, whatever it's called. I can't think of what that's called, but he refused to do that. But there was a couple of the different drugs that would give him heart palpitations. So there's like he sort of he'd seen me when he was 16 for anxiety or depression, I can't remember, but by the time he was 18 he'd sort of gone into this place because there'd been a couple of big traumas with an ex-girlfriend of his, and he had a lot of anxiety around this. So that's what sort of really triggered his. But yeah, so we got onto the triple drug, and some of the side effects, it's like you don't sleep all night. And then if you're not sleeping all night, your body has no choice but to run on adrenaline during the day. So if you are getting up and you've got to go to, say a counselling session at 11 o'clock in the morning, and you're trying to get some sleep because you only fell asleep at 4 o'clock in the morning, it's not a great night's sleep. So you get up, you have a coffee, you get going, your heart's pumping. And people who are anxious are really susceptible to being traumatized by their heart pumping, because they feel like an anxiety attack or a PTSD attack is coming. So when we are challenged via the side effects of medications, that can also put people into trauma about, well, how do I manage this and what am I going to do? Another thing, because it can also trigger those feelings that I'm going to have a heart attack. So the heart pumping is a real fear for people. They can often feel their heartbeat in their ears when they're on the wrong medications. And it's just educated guesswork, psychiatric drugs, and they will do the best they can, but it's educated guesswork as to what's going to work for someone. And actually, just thinking about the serotonin, so with serotonin, which is, we need them for both anxiety and depression. So with anxiety, we've got a lack of serotonin. Serotonin is calming and nurturing and makes us feel safe and grounded. So you can imagine we've got a lack of it in both depression and anxiety. Well, we make about 90% of serotonin in the small intestines. So serotonin is a nutrient that actually helps the bowels to work. So when we're constipated and sluggish again, there's often a lack of serotonin. So what's shut that down? So when we take an antidepressant that bypasses the gut, because it does, it can switch off the serotonin production in the intestines so that it can recycle the serotonin in the brain, because that's sort of how it's not quite, but it's sort of how the antidepressants work in the brain. So they help to keep that serotonin in there so we don't release it. So that's why we need to, build it up really slowly. But if we get the gut working better, once again, that can have a big impact on our moods, because there's this massive gut-brain connection as well. So when our gut is dysfunction, our brain is often dysfunctional too.
That was an area I was going to ask you about, actually, was the gut-brain microbiome is something that I've been thrown around quite a bit, but that gut-brain connection is also something I think has become really a lot more talked about in recent years.
Yes.
And, how that can, when your gut's not functioning properly, how much of an impact that has on
absolutely. And so many of these medications really do impact negatively on our microbiome. So even when they first started talking about it in my world about, say, 10, 12 years ago, I think they used to believe at the time maybe there was, say, 1,000, 1,500 different variety of bacteria. And then the next time I'd go along and they'd chat about it a few years later, they'd say, about 3,500, 4,000 different bacteria. And then, a year later it'd be, up to, they don't know. It's such a new area of expertise, except what they have found in Neanderthals, when they've actually got the biofilm off their teeth, even from tens of thousands of years ago, they had over 20,000 types of bacteria in their biofilm. So what's happening with our ultra-processed diet is that we're destroying our microbiome. So we're not eating as much fresh stuff. We're drinking water that's been chlorinated and fluoridated, which actually then destroys our gut bacteria as well. And we've not only got our microbiome, but we've got our viome as well. There's a guy called Zach Bush, MD. He's just phenomenal. He has spoken more on the viome in the last year, and which is our viral, the connection to the microbiome, which people wrongly include viruses in there, but it's actually not. It's its entire own world as well. So every time we're messing with these, for example, people who get kidney stones, there is a specific bacteria that stops you getting back kidney stones. So therefore, if you get kidney stones, you've destroyed that bacteria with antibiotics or antidepressants or, some medication or our diet, potentially alcohol or cigarettes or, something, or stress. Stress can really decrease it. They've done some studies with the microbiome in, I think it was Los Angeles women. They took them over and plonked them somewhere in Africa, can't remember where, and then they plonked some women from Africa in LA, and they got the LA women to eat African food and vice versa. And what they found with the African women was that their microbiome numbers it just dwindled. They went down to about 20% of the usual variety, and I think it was about a fortnight that they did that. And then the same thing happened with the LA women, was that their microbiome exploded into really good variety of bacteria. So it's amazing what we can do when you eat naturally, healthily, non-adulterated food. The body responds in kind. And a lot of people, once they start looking at diet, you can reverse things like heart disease and diabetes and obesity and the mental health massively. Makes a massive difference. One of my guys, he knows, this is another client with OCD and anxiety, so obsessive compulsive disorder. So this particular guy knows when he doesn't have enough fat in his diet, so the good fats, the olive oil, the avocados, the salmons, that sort of thing. If he's eating a diet rich in those, even on his medications, because he is on drugs for it, otherwise he feels quite heightened all the time and doesn't sleep. So it really impacts on him just massively. So if he has a weekend where he just blows it and he has pizzas and, a couple of beers and this and that and something else, he just knows it only takes a couple of days and he starts feeling crap and his OCD is through the roof again. So for him, he needs to keep at least 50% of his diet really good, healthy fats, just to help, because our brain is about 70% fat. Our cell membranes are a double fatty lipid layer. So if our cell membranes, one of the things that damages them is trans fats. So trans fats are those oils the bad oils. So like the genetically modified canolas, the things like peanut oils and things like that. There's some oils that are really bad for us, that when we heat them to over, just even cooking in them, it actually creates damage to our cell walls. So our cell walls, instead of being nice and healthy, they can end up being quite misshapen. And I see this in live blood screening. So I've been doing live blood screening for about 15 years now. So it means I take a drop of blood and put it under a slide and then have a look at people's blood. So it's been a very interesting thing. And sometimes when you look at people's blood, you go, okay, you don't eat a lot of fresh stuff, huh? You can really pick it a mile away. And some people who take the good fish oils and things like that, you know, they have a real impact. And speaking about that, they did a study with mental health, particularly, I think it was particularly anxiety and OCD, where they were looking at how much good fish oils people needed in order to start impacting on mental health. And it was about 2,000 micrograms a day of EPA. So in fish oils, there's EPA and DHA. So EPA is anti-inflammatory and it's also an antidepressant at that dose. DHA regenerates the brain. So people who do have, say, dementia or MS or something where the brain has shrunk for whatever, even people who are post-meth addicts, you know, and their brain has got little holes in them, you know, that sort of thing. It's the DHA in fish oils. It's a real powerful brain builder. The EPA is anti-inflammatory. So we need a good amount. And there was a study done in Japan a few years ago where they were looking at what percentage we need in the cell wall of EPA, DHA, maybe the combination. But basically it was about 8% of it was omega-3s, that's what it was. So it was omega-3s. So our cell membranes, in order to be happy, healthy and well, need to be about 8% omegas. And there are tests you can do these days to actually check out what percentage your cell membranes are. So that can also really help. It's so I think in Australia it costs about $100 to get that test done. It's not a huge big deal. But a lot of vegans are under 2%. And then people who make an effort with 1 or 2 bits of fish a week are often around that 3-4%. But people, say Japan or Italy, where they're eating plenty of fresh fish every day, you know, they're up around that 8%. And that, I think that's why there's so much less cardiovascular disease and diabetes and that sort of thing there as well. You know, there's blue zones in both. You've heard about the blue zones?
No.
So there's these things called blue zones around the world, and that's to do with where people have more longevity than other areas. So, yeah. And there's quite a few little areas. So there's an area in Japan, there's a few areas. There's one just outside LA. It's a religious something or other. I can't remember. But anyway, there's a few areas, and generally there's a few things that they do. They have a faith in something. They have community. It's not alcohol free. You know, they often talk about red wine. And it's not even carbohydrate free. But thinking about diet, you know, if we have an inflammatory diet, that's going to push inflammation. We can't have anxiety or depression without inflammation in our brain. So there's a direct correlation with chronic depression and chronic anxiety with inflammation in the brain. So everything we can do to make an anti-inflammatory diet, the better.
Right, yeah. Well, that's really informative. And yeah, one of those places I think is Okinawa in Japan.
That rings a bell. I was thinking Osaka, but I wasn't sure.
Quite commonly,
yes.
A lot of them live to over 100, yeah. So I learned that when I went there a couple of years ago. Interesting. Okie dokie. So what natural therapies can help, and what you find is most effective for anxiety and depression?
Okay. So, firstly with depression, so let's sort of recap again. Their poor little metabolism sluggish. Quite often their thyroid isn't working in the background. Sometimes their adrenals are exhausted. You know, so by the time someone's got depression and they're sort of flatlining, they don't have that oomph to get that cortisol. They don't have that oomph to get that adrenaline, noradrenaline in their world. So there are what we call adaptogenic herbs. Adaptogenic herbs help to allow our body to deal with more stress before we fall apart. So yay. So with depression, I like the ones that are slightly stimulating but not too much. So the ginsengs are a really good family. So withania is Indian ginseng. It's also known as ashwagandha, Siberian ginseng, Korean ginseng, American ginseng. So there's some really nice ginsengs in there and they all work with different levels of stress. So short, medium, long-term stress, and they also help cellular metabolism so that bit by bit we're getting stronger throughout. Because quite often with depression, I sort of say, so are you feeling, is it like full body or is it just your brain? And they go, oh no, I can't move. And go, okay, so it's full body depression. You can imagine the difference. Some people just want to lie in bed for 3 months. Everyone, once again, there's a whole spectrum with depression. And the other thing, so that's just one thing, but also B vitamins are crucial for people with depression because quite often the nervous system's exhausted. We need the Bs in there. But if we think about then toxicity for a second, I was thinking about a policeman I saw a few years ago, and he was a big, burly, 40-year-old policeman, muscly. He wasn't overweight at all. He was a really healthy-looking specimen of a human being. And I did a bioimpedance screening. Perfect muscle mass, perfect fat mass, perfect BMI. I did a oligo scan, which checked his mineral and heavy metals. And only 2 things showed up, actually 3 things. He was really low in magnesium, he was really high in mercury, and he was really low in iodine. So when we have excess mercury, it can bind the magnesium and make it unavailable in the body. So magnesium is calming and nurturing for our anxious humans, but it's also important to make ATP, which is our energy molecule. So if our muscle mass is low and our muscle quality is low, we're going to be low in magnesium. If we've got high mercury in the system, we're going to be low in magnesium. So the iodine connection there is to do with the thyroid. So we need iodine and tyrosine in order to make thyroxine that our thyroid needs to function. So I actually sent him off to go and get tests for Hashimoto's. So you can imagine most people, once again, on average, it takes 6 to 7 years to find a dysfunctional thyroid in Australia because doctors just look for the numbers on the page. They don't do anything else. And I think it's somewhere between 0.5 and 4.5 is considered absolutely perfectly normal for the thyroid stimulating hormone in Australia. So whereas anything within there, they say it's okay. Whereas women, for example, we feel best at 1.84. So every point over that, so 2.84, 3.84, takes about a year to get out. So by the time they find it, it's just not great. So I love the magnesium combinations for people with depression. I love the B vitamins, and quite often there's a lot of supplements with Bs and magnesiums together because it makes such good sense. And then adaptogenic herbs, there's a lot of them. There's oats and schisandra and nettles and rhodiola and romania. So there's so many beautiful herbal combinations that are nourishing to the nervous system. And I really like picking up the energy with something like Korean ginseng or oats, or a damiana is a great antidepressant. So there's, St. John's wort, good old St. John's wort, one of the most tested nutrients, herbs in the world for depression. For a long, long time, it was actually the number one thing to be prescribed in Germany for depression. And I'm not sure if that's still the case, but it was for many, many, many decades. They really loved it. So with anxiety, so once again, you've sort of got to calm down the brain in anxiety. So those things, once again, you wouldn't go the stimulating herbs in that case. So you wouldn't go the Korean ginseng or the Siberian ginseng. You're more likely to go American ginseng, which is non-stimulating, and then nourishing herbs like, once again, oats is nourishing, passion flower, it's calming, lime flowers is calming, lemon balm is calming, good old beautiful essential oils like lavender. I was listening to a doctor last week about anxiety, just with everything going on the planet at the moment, and he's recommending a lot of his clients put lavender on the lymph nodes in underneath here, because the lymph in our bodies are just struggling so much with all the trauma going on around the place that it helps to calm it, but it also moves the lymph. If our lymph is sluggish, we're going to feel sluggish as little human beings. So we need really nourishing, calming. GABA for anxiety, really powerful. Anything that calms the nervous system. There's like, for example, one of the products I use a lot is called Calmex, and it's got a combination of big doses of calcium, magnesium, potassium, some activated B vitamins, and the powder version has got some really it's just got, if the B vitamin pathways, let's talk pathways for a sec. There's some genes in there. There's something called a MTHFR gene. So the MTHFR gene, if we've got that, there's a real imbalance trying to convert our serotonin to melatonin to serotonin again. So sun goes up, our melatonin is supposed to change to serotonin. Sun goes down, converts to melatonin to help us sleep. So this conversion is happening all day, every day. How many people never see that sunshine? How many people, sleep too late and wake up too late? We are all doing all these things with our brains that we're not meant to be doing. And I was thinking about sleep hygiene before as well. How many of us have devices on all the time and close to the beds? That can really mess with our ability to switch off those blue lights and lights before bed. They stimulate the pineal gland. The pineal gland's supposed to be calming down at night time. But anytime we've got lights, whether it's TVs or phones or iPads or whatever, it's stimulating our pineal gland, waking it up. And once again, it actually can put the body into that state of anxiety and survival because it's not getting a good night's sleep. So the big things are calming herbs, adaptogenic herbs, nourishing herbs. And then if people do go and get further testing and find that they do have something like Graves' disease or Hashimoto's, then that puts us into another category where we're really looking at the thyroid as well. Yeah.
Just before I get you to talk about other natural therapies, when you're talking about supplements there, a lot of people obviously buy their supplements at a supermarket or something like that. Is quality of these sorts of supplements an issue with regards to that?
Yes. So most practitioner products, for a start, they get tested all the time. So if there isn't something in these ones, then we get in trouble. They get taken off the shelf, and some of the brands in Australia are amazing with their quality control. So they will actually keep stuff in warehouses for 2 years after the expiry date and then get independently tested on top of that, so that the rule is that there's a couple of brands who do it, but they have the full potency for up to 2 years after the expiry date. Stuff on the shelf in the supermarket, there's no quality control. So there have been several times over the years where they've taken a whole bunch of brands, looked at different things and found that there's very low levels of some of the ingredients. And of course the manufacturers know that there's just no quality control. So I'm glad if they work for people, but there's also a toxicity issue. So this is something that people might not have even thought about. So if, just say Metagenics, for example, so it's a practitioner-only brand. They have 6 methods of quality control. One of the methods they use is a $1 million machine that checks for a whole arsenal of toxins. And if they find any of those, the batch of herbs gets sent back to where it came from. That's one company and what they do, and they've got like half a dozen of these machines that are $1 million each. Most companies don't have the amount of money to do that here in Australia, but I know the practitioner-only ones do the best they can. But obviously that adds cost to the bottom line, with how much they can sell something for, obviously. But the difference is, if I'm buying, say, something with green tea in, and that green tea hasn't been checked, and it's one of a huge amount of pesticides can go into green tea. So just say I've got depression and I'm using green tea to help my liver cleanse, and all of a sudden I'm feeling worse, and then the doctor says, oh, it must be that green tea you're taking. Well, is it the green tea or is it the pesticides? So if we're not checking those things, sometimes it's not the herbs, sometimes it's not the dosage, sometimes it can actually be the pesticides themselves. and especially some countries in the world are really quite dodgy with what they will do to herbs to make them weigh more, to be able to charge companies more money. So there are techniques that are used from countries around the world to make herbs weigh more, which is really dodgy, but it's done a lot. And if people aren't checking, they're not going to know. So there are definitely some countries in the world that I would not buy from in a pink fit. Just would not. So yes, know where your products are coming from. Yes.
Okay, no, thank you for that. So you spoke about obviously herbs and supplements, etc., for treating anxiety and depression. What are some of the other therapies that work well?
Yeah, so things like now I wanted to I'll mention this as well. So I mentioned briefly about electromagnetic frequencies before, so the blue lights and that sort of thing. Now, one of the things is, as we get more and more and more smart devices in the home, is that there's more electromagnetic frequencies. All of our smart devices, that's like a radio station everywhere it goes. So it's constantly pinging, and the only reason it's pinging is because of the radio waves inside our houses. There has been a direct increase in anxiety in children as they've used more devices, both personally and in the home and in schools. So they know that these things are affecting our brains. So one of the things that we've got to do is start limiting screen time for our children and ourselves. And it's really challenging because everything is screen time at the moment, isn't it? It's a really challenging thing to do. But that awareness, making sure you get outside and ground, making sure you get outside in your lunch break and have some sunshine, making sure you are doing things to make sure that you are bringing yourself back down, so crucial for our mental health. With anxiety, there is often histamine build up in the brain as well. So anything that helps to pull histamine out, like big doses of vitamin C in the short term, or N-acetylcysteine, glutathione. So when there is damage to the brain because of inflammation, that's sort of what I'm thinking there. So because with depression and anxiety, there's inflammation in the brain. Inflammation attracts histamines, particularly in the gut, the brain, the uterus, and the spine. EMFs build up in the gut, the brain, the testicles, and the spine. So there's a real correlation between EMFs and histamines. Now, histamine isn't just about allergies. Histamine is a healing neurotransmitter in the body, and we're supposed to be able to release it, but sometimes we can't, once again, if it gets out of balance and if we have too much. And histamine can also be one of those things eating away at brain tissue. So we've got to do something to pull that histamine out if that works in people's world. And like I say, there are some easy things like N-acetylcysteine, glutathione, vitamin C, cheap, easy things that we can really start with to try to help those. Essential oils are amazing. You know, the way that essential oils work, there's no calories associated with them. They don't fix anything in the body. But what they do is activate neurotransmitters in the body, which is so amazing. So when we're breathing in something like lavender, assuming we don't have any negative correlation to it, but if we're breathing in lavender, it's going straight through the nose and up into the amygdala. The amygdala is right up here. So if it starts calming the amygdala down, once again, that's going to help to switch off our fight, our rage, our anger, our fear, our being threatened, our pain punishment circuits. So it goes straight into the amygdala, which is what the power of the sense of smell. So anything we can do along those lines, quite incredible. There's an abdominal massage called Chini Seng. So Chini Seng is abdominal. You spend an hour to an hour and a half on the abdomen. And basically, because so many of our body organs are down here, our liver, our kidneys, our adrenals, our spleen, our pancreas, our intestines, by spending an hour in that area, the Chinese call that the seat of our soul. And that's why they call them our gut emotions. So in areas in there, as we're working through an abdominal massage, the areas that are tense, those organs can be really holding on to emotions. So the liver is about rage, anger, frustration, internally depression. Our kidneys and adrenals are about too much fear and anxiety. Our spleen and stomach are about a lack of empathy and sympathy. Our intestines can be that imbalance between love, joy, hate, and then the grieving process afterwards. So all of our organs have specific connections to different emotions as well. So it's really interesting for people when having a Chini Seng abdominal massage and feeling which areas are really tense and then knowing what that connects to energetically. And I had one lady, once again with one of my big practices that I ran, and she'd had anxiety since she was 13, I think. That's when her father died. And that really triggered a lot of anxiety for her. She was like the 5th eldest out of 6 kids or 7 kids or something. And she was the one who had to, go to school and miss her dad's funeral. And the whole thing was bizarre. But anyway, this anxiety for her, she had never been able to breathe deeply. So, in a meditation class, when they tell us to belly breathe, she'd never been able to do that. And I think after the second Chini Seng, she started being able to breathe for the first time since she was 13, and she would have been, I'd guess, 40 years old at that time. So it's amazing what it can do, because when we are anxious for many, many years, we're shallow breathing. So people who tell us to belly breathe, if we've actually built up scar tissue, underneath the rib cage, that's there. That's scar tissue, and the body's done it deliberately to help us cope with that shallow breathing. So it actually almost creates an environment it feels really hard to shift. So something like Chini Seng, because it's getting that blood supply, that nervous system energy, that circulation going through all those major organs in a very specific, targeted, logical manner, it allows everything to work. And some people can breathe. Some people can just start to breathe after that. It can be quite amazing. So we're sort of thinking about sleep hygiene, the adaptogenic herbs, fresh air, sunshine, exercise, grounding, 7 hours sleep a night. They actually did look at a minimum of 7 hours sleep for people with anxiety and depression in a study. And once again, they found that those who can't get that 7 hours sleep will always have an issue with, not only the ability to calm down anxiety and pick up depression, but it adds to all of the other health issues as well. It adds to the risk of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, obesity, that type of thing as well. So I think, I think that's a bit of them. And diet, of course, anti-inflammatory diet.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, there are lots and lots of different therapies out there, I guess. Natural therapies, there are so many of them. Have we covered how they can help? I guess we probably have in all that we have talked about.
Well, yeah, I was even just thinking about acupuncture, because I had an acupuncturist working with me for 4 years. Actually, I had 2 acupuncturists, and they sort of talk about the way that acupuncture works. And I'm going to get this wrong if there's any acupuncturists out there. But because acupuncture, again, they use a pulsing technique to work out, which organs are hyper and hypo working. So they've sort of got this, once again, educated guesswork as to where they need to work in the body with their acupuncture points. And because it's something in it, like it flips an inflammatory. There's something about inflammation that flips with acupuncture in many people. So some people it just works brilliantly, and I'm just not a needle girl, so it's not something I have had, with my mate Rob. I've had 4 sessions, and I avoid him like the plague until I have to. But yeah, so it's like for some people it's just that magical little flip of a switch, that can really help to target their neural emotional pathways to work better.
And I guess that's probably part of it as well, as people finding what works for them, because there's all sorts of things like mindfulness and meditation and yoga and Reiki. There's a ton of practices out there that people can try, and obviously they do connect with some and not necessarily with others.
Even good old Reiki, it's amazing what Reiki can do in a session. And like everything, there's a spectrum of Reiki people out there, and it really is about finding that person who works for your energy. And I know when Gabby used to work on me, my nervous system would just go, and it's amazing how fast time flies when you're relaxed.
Yes, it certainly is. I suppose the other thing that I want to ask you is the difference between what natural therapies can do for somebody and traditional therapies.
Okay. No, good plan. So medication-wise, so when someone goes to a doctor, they're going to try to find the best drug that works for that person. And the theory with medicine is that there's a biochemical imbalance, and they're trying to fix that biochemical imbalance. Very rarely do people get results just on that alone. I find most of my clients need to do some sort of talk therapy in the background, whether it's cognitive therapy, whether it's counseling, whether it's seeing a psychologist, some sort of talk therapy, because at some point you've got to get out of your head, work out what's going on, and start changing those thought behaviors. So at some stage that's going to be important. From a natural therapy perspective, once again, going back to that biochemical imbalance, which, by the way, they've never proven that it's serotonin for depression. So there's some things that have never been proven in, many decades. And in fact, most drugs from that perspective would not be on the market if they'd gone through the current ways of testing medications. Was released in a study with about 8 years ago, something like that. So once again, looking at serotonin, when you think about the neurotransmitter serotonin, it's a neurotransmitter. So what does it take to create neurotransmitters in your body? It takes nutrition. So the structure of, say, serotonin requires magnesium, B vitamins, tyrosine. So if you end up giving your body the nutrients to create the neurotransmitters, that allows your body to naturally make whatever neurotransmitters you require, as opposed to putting a targeted drug in there, which, as we know, they'll start off with 50 milligrams and then go to 100, then go to 150, and then they'll add in a second drug, and then they'll increase that, and they just, it's quite a different way of thinking about it. But every cell in the body has got 500,000 receptor sites for many, many things. So those receptor sites are for all of our minerals, all of our hormones, all of our neurotransmitters. And if they are not needed, then the cells will also start to change. So if we constantly have a lack of magnesium, our receptors for magnesium might start dying off. If we have too much caffeine, on the other way, we'll actually make more caffeine receptors on our cell walls. So the cells are constantly changing and adapting depending on what we give them. So if we're giving a drug that, say, keeps serotonin in our body, doesn't actually give you serotonin, it's a reuptake inhibitor, many of them. So it's trying to stop you from releasing it. So people think it increases serotonin. That's not how they work. So it's actually doing something in the background to stop you releasing your serotonin. Whereas naturally, if we start to give herbs and nutrients that allow the nerves to work better, the organs to work better, the brain to work better, the neurotransmitters tend to take care of themselves. So it's quite a different way of looking at it. And it ends up nourishing the body. Whereas long-term on the medications, there's no nourishment there. All it's doing is making people feel better in that moment, which is fine. Nothing wrong with feeling better, but it's not fixing the problem long-term. And that's what people will say when they've been on these medications for 5, 10, 15 years. How do I get off? And in fact, most people have tried and don't want to get off. By the time I see people, they say, no, I'm on Lexapro, I don't want to get off it. They just are too frightened to even try. So then I'm working in the background with natural therapies to try to nourish their nervous system in behind without messing with the drug. Yeah. So really, we're trying to regenerate organs and regenerate nerves and regenerate the brain with natural therapies, whereas we're just replacing something. Or really, doctors are after about getting those numbers on the page right. It's all about, if you're out of balance, they want you back in the middle, and then, off you go, you're all fine. And that's not what I find. I find people come in and they've been seeing doctors and they've had all the blood work done, nothing's showing up, and so it's something else. Time for something else.
I guess what I'm sort of taking from that too, from me, is that one really just looks at the symptom, gives you something to deal with the symptoms, whereas the other one is sort of trying to, I suppose, look a little bit further at the cause and the,
yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think people think that they are dealing with the cause, but they're actually not. And we've been taught that because we're told it's a chemical imbalance. So because we're taught it's a chemical imbalance, we think that's it. So yep, I've got a deficiency of Lexapro. And many people just are not told there's any other solutions.
Yeah, that's been my take on it. That this is a problem. Here's your fix.
Yes.
Off you go. Yeah. But you really need to. That's always going to be a problem if you don't. Why is that a problem?
Yeah.
And I guess that's where I think natural medicine comes into it.
Yes, absolutely.
And deal with that, and then the problem goes away. Okay, there was something else I was going to ask you. Now it's gone. Is there anything else, I guess, from your perspective that you think we haven't covered that you would like to cover in terms of?
Oh, look, I think.
I'm sure there's a wealth of it.
Yeah, I think just remember that your health, your life. So take control of your health, because so often we put these doctors on a pedestal. And look, they've done a lot of training, they know a lot of stuff, but they don't know your body the way you know your body. So if you feel something isn't working for you, make sure you reach out and try to find a second opinion, third opinion, fourth opinion. It's your body, it's your life. You're entitled to be happy. You're entitled to live fear-free. You're entitled to live without anxiety. There's always solutions out there. It's just finding the one that's perfect for you.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's been really, really good. I'm sure there's plenty more, but yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. If there is, I'll give you a hoy and ask you. Yeah.
Cool. Anytime.
And so you've got a YouTube channel?
Yes. So it's New Leaf. Yes. Sorry. So it's New Leaf Health Team, and it's it's cool. I've got like 14,000 subscribers, and I've got about 1,000 videos on there, and most of them are me doing kinesiology because that's what people like. But I do have a lot of informational videos on there as well. And I've got a Facebook page, which is New Leaf Natural Therapies. And I've got another one on Facebook called The Brain Centre at New Leaf Natural Therapies. So I've got a couple of Facebook pages too. I've tried to get into the other social medias, but everything's too hard to do everything. So that's where I spend most of my time. Yeah.
Definitely is. People wanting to access, I suppose, natural therapies that aren't, what do you suggest would be a good way for them to get started? They're sort of in the traditional anxiety, depression treatment that they've had.
Yeah.
And they're wanting to look for an alternative. What do you suggest is a good place?
I think for a start, ask your family and friends if they've found anyone that they trust.